Hi, I'm Robert Joseph, and today I'm going to teach you how to make this jumpsuit. Now, a couple of things about the jumpsuit itself is it takes 2 lengths of elastic, and I'm using 3/4 inch wide elastic, and the elastic will go up here above the bust and also here at the waistband. The straps here are optional, as well as the sash. The hat here is not included in the pattern. My mannequin does not have a wig, so I just quickly made a hat to actually cover her bald head. So with that, there are also pockets in this pattern. So if you don't want the pockets, of course, don't install them, and you can just simply skip over that part of the video. You should also know that in the video, I'm using a cover stitch for the elastic above the bust and also for the hem. If you don't have a cover stitch machine, you can use a zigzag machine. Now, this jumpsuit I actually made out of a knit fabric, while this jumpsuit, as you can see, it's much smaller. And in the video, I will explain that I'm using a half-size pattern, and that's so that I can fit all of the pattern pieces within the frame of the video. So let me just take this off of my half-size dress form here for a minute so you can see. I have everything exactly the same. I'm going to take the sash off here. I'm using all the same widths of elastic for the top and for the waist, and all of the seam allowances for the half-size pattern. Now, the pattern that you're purchasing does not have the half-size pattern, but it has all the sizes extra small through double XL. But again, I'm just using a half-size pattern so that I can get all of the pattern and fabric in the frame of the video. Everything else is the same. With one exception, and that is the hem. So on this one, I simply just turned up the hem the amount and stitched it down, while on this, on the half size, I actually just rolled the hem, and I walk you through that process in the video. So you should know that if you're going to make this out of knit, and the reason you're able to make it out of knit or out of woven, as I've done in the video, is because this is a somewhat oversized pattern. So you can see the drapiness here. And also, if this were a full size, it would have a little bit of extra fabric. So if you're going to make it out of knit, which I've done here, is that you're going to need to cut off 1/4 inch of the seam allowance. This pattern comes with 1/2 inch seam allowances, which are for a woven fabric. And then, of course, I also walk you through the finishing of the edges on an overlock machine. If you don't have an overlock machine, you can simply do another row of stitching on the outer edge of the seam allowance, or you can do a zigzag stitch to actually finish that seam allowance. But just be advised that for the major seams on a knit fabric, you'll need to actually cut off 1/4 inch of the fabric to actually get to that that 1/2 inch seam allowance in total. Also, even if you're going to be doing the pockets that are here, if I can get in here, there's a pocket here on the knit, you're going to be doing that with a regular straight stitch machine, and you're going to do them exactly the same way I have done them here. I do require interfacing for the pocket area, and that's for the stability of the garment. So just be advised that, especially here, if you're going to be using knit, you'll need to put the stabilizer here around the pocket area. I'd like to let you know a few things about the video before we get started. This is a really long video, and I supplied you with chapter markers below for your convenience. However, I would advise you that if you do choose to skip around, you may be missing valuable information as we go along. Now, I'm not a big fan of voiceovers, so I actually narrate the videos as I'm sewing and constructing the garment. So I know that I do get kind of wordy, and that's one of the reasons that the video gets a little bit longer, but I'm really trying to bring you the most information I can so that your garments will actually come out the best you can possibly make them. And the last thing is, which is kind of minor, is that I no longer put background music to my videos. I was having a lot of problems with copyright issues on the music that I was creating for my own videos. So my suggestion is to put a little music in the background if you prefer while you're listening and sewing along with me. So if you're all ready to go with your pattern and your fabric, let's start making your garment. Okay, so we're about ready to begin, and I have my fabric already. This is actually a lightweight cotton fabric. And just before we begin, I want to talk about the pattern just really quickly. So one thing to note for me, I'm going to be using half-size patterns. So it will seem like everything that I'm doing is smaller than what you have, but it's really hard to get the full-size pattern inside the video frame. So I'm using half-size patterns. All of the seam allowances, hem allowances, and the casing amounts at the top and the bottom of the bodice are all the same. So I've just shrunk the size of the pattern itself to fit it into the frame. So process is exactly the same. So we have our pant. This is a jumpsuit romper. And so we have our left and our front and our back pattern pieces for the pant here. And then we have the bodice. This is the front and this is the back. One thing to note about the bodice is that I have double notches down here, which actually indicate the waist or the bottom of the bodice, instead of double notches being for the back, which I have here on the back pant. In this case, for the bodice, we're going to identify the waist. And then, of course, I have the pocket pattern. And if you choose not to put the pocket pattern in, then you can just skip that part of the video and go straight to the outseam. But this one you'll need to cut 4 of this because you'll have a front and back pocket on either the left and right pant. And then I have here, this is the shoulder strap. Now, if you don't want the shoulder strap, you don't have to use this. That's an option. And again, I'm going to cut this on the straight grain. Usually shoulder straps are cut on the bias, but I wanted to save some fabric, so it's the same process to create straps, but they're a little bit wider than we would normally make on the bias. So I'm going to cut this on the straight grain. And then we have the sash. And of course, this is actually an option for you. You don't have to do this, but it makes a nice little presentation at the waist. So there's one other pattern piece on here that you need to know about, and it goes along with the pocket. And that is this interfacing. And what the interfacing is going to do is we're going to put it on the wrong side of the fabric along the areas of the pocket and the areas of the pant where we need that stability. So we're going to use that interfacing there. Now, if you have a heavier fabric, you don't have to use it, but I'm going to tell you right now, it actually makes your pocket a lot more stable, strong, and makes a nice presentation. So the kind of interfacing that I use is a knit interfacing, even though I'm using a woven. This interfacing is called I'm using the Pellon EK130 Easy Knit interfacing, and I use this for almost all of my apparel making because this has a really great hand to it, and because it's knit, it actually flows with the hand of the fabric. So that's what I will be using. The other thing is I've got elastic. We have elastic at the top of the bodice and also at the waist area. So I've pre-cut my elastic. I'm using 3/4 inch wide elastic. That's what I have built for the casings. You'll notice I have a 1-inch casing up here at the top, and then down here it says 1-inch seam. Now, if you want to use a smaller elastic, like 1/2 inch elastic, I would advise you to take off about 1/4 inch here and 1/4 inch here at the bottom. That way your seams won't be too big and your elastic won't kind of run amok inside the casing. So you want that elastic to be kind of snug in there. So I'm using 3/4 inch wide, and again, I've pre-cut this. Okay, so I'm ready to lay out the fabric, and as I mentioned about the pattern being half size, I've also cut down the width of my fabric to be half size so that the layout for you would actually be very similar. Of course, refer to your the pattern information for suggested layouts for your sizes. So now I've cut this and I've actually already folded it in half because I'm going to need 2 pant legs for almost 2 of everything except for the front and back bodice. Now, one thing to look at your fabric is that you may want to just double check if you have a one-way or a two-way fabric. If, like for instance, this is only a one-way directional print, so whatever way I decide to lay, for instance, let me put the back pattern on here, back pant here. If I lay this like this, and then on my next cut for my front, if I lay it like this, those I'm going to have dual patterns and they're not going to be going the same way. So I have to make sure that I have everything lined up going the same way if I have a directional print. So just keep that in mind. Of course, if you have a solid, you probably don't really need to worry about that unless you have a very obvious nap, which is the direction the fabric has been woven. So I'm going to get this all laid out, and I'm actually not going to be putting the smaller pattern pieces in, such like the pocket and the strap, kind of in any areas around the larger pieces that they can fit. Okay, so as I lay this out and get everything cut, I will speed this part of the video up. Okay, so now that everything is cut out, we can actually start sewing. Before I get into that, I actually want to just mention, I didn't mention this before, but I have dotted lines here on the pant legs should you desire to make a short pant, or I say a calf length. This is actually a little bit below the knee area. So this is where you would want to cut your pattern off, or at least the fabric. So I just wanted to mention that. So to get started, we're actually going to, I'm actually going to work on the straps. So I'm going to clear the rest of the table, and I'm actually going to be bringing in my pressing mat, because from here on out, we're going to be sewing and pressing. So I'm going to bring my iron in and my pressing mat, but I'm first going to start with these shoulder straps. All right, so we're going to start with the shoulder straps, and I have 2 here. And if you're not going to put shoulder straps on, then of course you can skip this step and move on to the next. So all we're going to do is fold these in half lengthwise. And we're going to stitch from the cut edge a 1/2 inch. And then we'll come right back here. Okay, so just one quick note before I start sewing these. I have some tape markings on my machine, and that's to tell me where the 1/2 inch is for my guide. Now, on a lot of the newer machines, the needle position starts over here on the left, but I don't like sewing in that position, so I like to have it in the center. So I had to put some guides on my machine for the 1/2 inch seam allowance. So when you sew this, it doesn't matter where your machine needle actually sets or how you prefer to sew with this particular placement of the needle. Just make sure that you're sewing this at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so we've got this seam sewn, and I've actually completed the other strap. This is what it's going to look like when we get done with it. So I know we have a wide piece of fabric and we have this wide seam allowance. It seems like I could have had a smaller width, but I feel like when I have a narrow width of fabric to stitch on, I don't get a very good stitch quality. So that's why I use a wider piece of fabric. So now what we're going to do is we're actually going to trim this seam allowance down, and we want to make it just a little bit more narrow than the edge, the folded edge to the stitch. So this is about 1/4 inch. It's a little over 1/4 inch. So I'm going to trim this side down to about maybe about 3/16. But I'm just going to keep an eye on it. Make sure it's just slightly smaller than the width of your the part that's actually going to be the strap. And then I'm going to be using a loop turner. If you don't have a loop turner, the other way you could actually do this, it will make your strap a little bit wider, is to fold the cut ends into the center and then fold it over again and just top stitch everything closed. Okay, so here is my strap. I've trimmed it. So now I'm just going to use my loop turner, and the loop turner has a little hook here to hook onto the end. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to get this in here. Let's see, this is probably a better end. Inside the loop all the way up, and then I'm just going to grab this end. Make sure I get this in the camera like that, right? I'm going to grab that end. I'm going to poke the little arm. There's a little arm here that actually closes over. Which way am I going here? Let's see if I can. There. So there's a little arm here. And I'm going to actually get that kind of pierced through the fabric. Okay, so it's in there. It's grabbing that fabric end. And then once it's inside that loop, I'm just going to push the fabric around very carefully. And if I kind of wiggle this end and kind of pick over this end, I can feel it kind of go over the edge. And once it goes over that edge, where am I going in the camera here? Here on this side, actually, it's here. You just want to take that and pull it, the fabric over that edge until the fabric comes out the other end here. And now, whoops, that kind of came off. Well, at least it came out the other end, because now we're just going to be moving this fabric to the outside. And then see your seam there, just kind of finger press it along that seam. And having that seam allowance just under the width of the strap actually kind of fills it rather nicely. And I'm just going to pick this part out here. And then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to press this nicely. And then we have our straps all ready to go onto our bodice. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to go grab the bodice pieces. Okay, so now that we have the straps all ready, we can actually join them or attach them to the bodice. And so I have the front and back bodice here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually lay these out with face side up. So there's the front bodice. And then there's the back bodice. And I'm going to look for those notches at the top of the bodice, which is a single notch, and the single notch at the top are for the placement of the strap. So, instance, the strap would actually go here. Okay, and so let's look for the single notches on the front bodice. So here's the single notch. So basically, if I have a single notch here, I'm going to place the strap here, and then the strap for the back would also be placed, let's see, there to there. But that's not how we really want them to be sewn on, because it wouldn't work. So the easiest way that I know, actually just laying everything out flat, here, I've got the single notches up here at the top of the bodice on the front. And this is the single notches here for the back at the top of the bodice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn the back bodice around. And so now I have the double notches on both of the bodices matching. And what I'm first going to do is I'm going to attach the straps to the front at these notches. And you'll notice you have the seam that we use to actually press this nice and flat. I'm actually going to face the seam toward the side seam. So let's get this pinned here. This is on the front. Okay. And then let's do this one, find that seam. So there's that seam, and here's that other notch. And we're going to pin that here. All right, so that's to the front. Now basically I have the other notches right here, and we need to match these here. But if I pull this, I'm going to move this other piece. So what I'm just going to do is I'm going to just move this up so I won't have to move this. And that just is ease for pinning. And I'll also make sure that I'm definitely going to get this straight where I'm not twisting that strap. So here's the mark on the back. I'm going to get this pinned. And then, of course, the other right here. And of course, the placement notches are suggestions. If you feel like you need to spread them out a little bit or make them a little bit more narrow, you can do that. You could also, you may just want to check for the length. You could also crisscross them if that's a style that you are into. So just make sure that you may need a little bit more strap if you're going to crisscross them. But this is the way I'm going to get them pinned on. And so we need to tack these on here. Okay, so to tack these on here with the sewing machine, we're going to tack them in two places. And let me do it. I think this is a better view in the camera. So we're first going to tack them about 1/4 inch. And I'm just going to mark here where that 1/4 inch is. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and do that on all 4 of them. And I'm using, this is actually a friction pen. It's erasable. It comes off with a little bit of heat. Now, remember that we have a 1-inch casing. So eventually this edge will be folded under. This is the face side, and then we're going to fold this under 1 inch. And I'm going to be using 3/4 inch elastic, wide elastic, if you remember that from the cutting part. So by folding this under 1 inch, if we attach this at the 1/4 inch, once we fold it, the strap will be still kind of moving around, and it won't have a lot of stability. So what I want to do is I want to do another tack so that these stay in place and they won't pull out. So if we only tack it in the one place, then it's not going to be very strong, and then your strap may rip off while you're wearing it. So I'm going to actually tack this at just below 1 inch from the edge. So I'm going to use my ruler, and I'm going to mark here from the edge of the fabric, the edge of the strap, about 7/8. And that will give me 1/8 inch leeway. So, and I'll mark all of those at 7/8. And do the same for the front. Okay, so here's the last one. Okay, so now I'm actually going to go over to the machine and tack these in 2 spots. Now, the reason I'm actually tacking it here at the 1/4 inch is also because I'm going to be overlocking this edge after we sew the side seams. So we want to make sure that the bottom of the straps get caught in that overlocking. So that's why I've done the 2 stitches and not just one up here at the 7/8. Okay, so let's go over to the machine and get this tacked on, and then we'll be right back here to do the side seams. Okay, so now that we have the straps on, right, these are all sewn on, we're actually going to place the front and back bodices face sides together, and I just need to lift these up here and make sure that we're going to match the side seams. So the straps should be up. This is the front bodice, and then I've got the back bodice here. We're going to match the notches there. Okay, and I'm just going to, let's see, pin in the direction of the sewing. And this is going to be sewn at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. And I'm actually going to do a few steps in one before I come back to talk about the next step. So what's going to happen is, let me get this pinned and then I'll explain. Just for time constraints on the video. So, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to sew the side seams again. We have the front and the back bodice face sides together. I'm going to join them together at the side seams, 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm going to overlock this edge and I'm going to press it toward the back. And then I'm going to come back and I'm going to overlock the top edge of the bodice here. We're just going to overlock that. And then after that, we'll come back here and we'll press it down 1 inch. Okay, so we have our side seams all done and we've got our top of our bodice overlocked. Now, one note about this that I didn't mention before is that you'll have to be very careful overlocking the edge of this, that you don't cut it and then turn over 1 inch, because if you cut it accidentally and you turn over 1 inch, then it's going to actually be shorter than what you need. So you could press it first and then overlock it. But remember, we have 3/4 inch elastic going in here, so we can't really lose that much of it because we've got a stitch here in the middle of the overlocking to actually stitch this to the body. So I'm going to press this over and just kind of put it up here on the ironing board, and you'll need a ruler handy and your iron. So I'm going to press this over. This is the back. Now on the front, before I get to the front, hang on, make sure that you're pressing over 1 inch. And I'll mention the front once we get there. All right, you want to have a nice, good line. You don't have to press too hard, but make sure you have a good line there. For that pressing over. So keep measuring your inch. Now you see at the side seam it seems a little bit crooked, and that's because the front has a slight curve to it. So you will need to ease that in as you're sewing. So I'm just going to make sure that I get a nice curve here. Make sure that, kind of getting around here, that it's 1 inch, okay? That's where those see-through rulers kind of come in handy. It's because you can use them several ways. You can either use it this way or this way. Now, what you can do to ease this in, which I may just do while I'm over at the sewing machine, is to run a basting stitch along the edge there, maybe where the overlocking stitch is, and then just kind of do like a slight gather just for the front part, just to ease it into that, to what you're stitching it down to, because what you're stitching it down to, which is the bodice, is actually smaller than the edge. Okay, so we're coming back to the back here. Okay. And I'll do that and probably just ease a little bit of that. So let me show you the front again. Let me see, where's the front? This is the front. So you see here that it's just kind of gaping a little bit. If you just do like a little running stitch between each of the shoulder straps and then just kind of do a little bit of gathering to just ease that in there in the front. You see I'm kind of pinching how much is there. It's about 1/4 of an inch. But if you ease that under with a little gathering stitch, then it will lay flatter for you when you sew. Now the other thing too, you'll see me do this, is I'm going to leave an opening here in the back, and I'm going to leave it here open between the side seam and the first back strap. So that's where we're going to be inserting our elastic, so we'll need an opening. So I'll probably start here, go all the way around, and just past the second back strap, I'll just kind of stop. No need to back stitch because we're going to stitch that closed, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and get started. And I guess the first thing you'll see me do is do a running stitch between the front shoulder straps. I'll just kind of gather that a little bit, and then I'll go ahead and begin my stitching. And actually, I'll probably pin it while I'm over there at the machine. Okay, so now we have the bodice already, and we're ready to actually install the elastic, and we have this opening right here. That's where we're going to install the elastic. So I'll just lay this here for just a sec. So you're going to need a big safety pin, and then of course the elastic. Cut the appropriate size. Of course, you can follow the suggested amounts that I have on the pattern, or you can just measure yourself around the body with the elastic for what your comfort is. So what I need to do first is I need to mark my overlap, and we're going to be overlapping the two ends on top of each other. So I'm going to actually make markings about a 1/2 inch in. That's what my seam allowance is. So I'll just mark on either the ends a 1/2 inch, because that's where we're gonna overlap once we get the elastic through the casing, okay? So I'm gonna use a big safety pin, and what I like to do is I kind of like to pierce it or thread it through, kind of going in and out. That's how I kind of like to do it. But of course you can just stick it in there at the end and pull it through. So I just like to do this because I feel like for me, it feeds it through a little bit more evenly. And then of course, close the safety pin on it. And this is what we're gonna use to feed it through. So in through the opening, and then just push it into that. Kind of be gentle at the beginning because you don't want to rip those stitches out, so just kind of help it get into that tunnel, which we call a casing, and then it will feed it all the way through. Now you also want to be careful that you don't lose your end all the way in there. Sometimes what I'll do is I will take another safety pin, and instead of putting it horizontal with the elastic, I'll actually put this in a vertical mode or perpendicular to the elastic, and I'll put that on there, and at least it will give a little bit more pull so I know something's going on at the end. So I'm just going to continue pushing this. So I'm holding on to that safety pin and then gently holding the other where I want it to go through, and then push the safety pin up. You can feel it going under your fingers. Push all the way up and then hold on tight with the other hand and then pull the fabric through. So that's for the beginners who aren't sure how to get that fed through. Once you come up to the seam allowances, you may have to jiggle this around because sometimes it gets stuck in that seam allowance, and then just continue pushing and pulling to feed it through. And then sometimes it gets a little bunched up, so you just kind of have to pull that fabric along the elastic. Now, of course, I'm working on a half size again, so it will take me not that long to get this through. You see at the other end, it's actually there, so having this safety pin at the end kind of helps it from actually feeding all the way through there. Okay, we're getting back to the end. Move some of that back. And you see now, here I've got my safety pin all the way coming back to the end, and now I can just kind of gently pull it out. Now, one thing that you want to double check is you kind of want to move the fabric around to kind of a little bit even. And you want to feel with your fingers all the way through, and making sure that elastic hasn't twisted in there. So I've got enough coming out here. We want to make sure that we see enough of this elastic. I'm just going to pull some of this aside, and then I'm going to kind of bring this back. You see how that kept that from going inside? So that's just kind of a little tip there for you. I'm going to pull this kind of back out because I need enough fabric to get it into the machine to stitch this together. Okay, so now I've got the ends. I'm going to take the safety pins off. Now these are coming out. Let me see if I can show you, get this flat. I need this to go on top of each other, either this way or this way. Make sure that you don't twist it accidentally. So I'm going right on top of those marks, okay, to make a nice loop. And I'm just going to actually pin this way, okay? See that? So now all I need to do is stitch the elastic together along my mark. Okay, so now that the elastic is done, let me trim off these threads. I didn't trim at the machine. Okay, so now we just need to get this to go back inside all of this. And all we need to do is just kind of move this fabric along that. And of course, we could have also stitched these down. That would have helped, but I'm just going to tuck them right in here, and then I'll just kind of pull some of this other fabric kind of over until we have that done. I'm going to move this back. I'm going to make it kind of flat again. Let's see if we can get this moved along a little bit. I'm going to stretch that. What we want to do now is we want to actually stitch this closed. So let me see if I can move this way. It seems to move better this way. If I move all that down, okay, kind of pull that over. Is that right? Yeah. Okay, and I'm actually just going to pin. I'll have to stretch the elastic. Whoops, I need to go this way. I'm just going to pin where I want to stitch. Okay, and make sure we don't want to actually stitch on the elastic. So we just want to stitch it closed, kind of there where I stitched before. It was right here, right in the middle of the overlocking. So I just kind of want to follow that stitch along to get everything closed, and then we'll be able to actually manipulate the fabric around to make the fabric go around it a little bit more even. Okay, and then after this, we'll be all ready to work on the pockets. Okay, so I've closed that area of the elastic, and you can kind of see where it's kind of flat here. So what we want to do is we just kind of want to move some of this. I'm holding back here while I'm pulling some of the fabric over that area. You can see it better here. I'll just pull some of this. Now, if the fabric doesn't move over the elastic, it may be because you have actually stitched onto the elastic, which would not allow the fabric to move around. So I'm just kind of moving this around, stretching it, just kind of pushing that fabric along until we get a more even looking distribution. So okay, so this is the back, and this here, what you're seeing now is, no, that's the back actually, and this is the front. I know because it's a little bit more scooped. And we've got our straps. Now it looks kind of funny right now, but this is actually going to be scrunched up like this. Once we get it into the pant, we get that elastic on the pant. So this is our bodice. The bodice is all prepared. Now we're going to go ahead and work on the pant, and we're going to start working with the pockets. Okay, so to get the pockets going, we're actually going to need one of the pant legs. Actually, we're just going to be putting them on the front pant leg. So we're going to work with the front, and I'm just going to do one. And it will be the exact same thing for the opposite side. So this is the front of the pant. And then I'm going to grab one pair, so it's two of them, and they need to be mirrored. So I've got two here. So what I mean by mirrored is, let me just get these two pieces here separated. So this is the face side, and this is the face side, and now these are mirrored copies of each other. Okay, so you need to make sure that they're mirrored. Make sure that you don't have two that look like this. Let me get the other one here so you can see what not to do. Okay, so you don't want this. You don't want them to look the same. So you need to make sure that they're mirrored so that they can actually go face sides together. Okay, so they've got to look like this. Now the first thing that we're going to do actually is we are going to actually be fusing our interfacing to the stitching areas. So the stitching areas here on the edges and on the side seam here at the outseam. Sometimes you'll hear me say outseam or side seam. So I need to apply interfacing to all of these pieces. So for this one, let me flip this over. We're going to apply the interfacing to the side seam of the pocket on that one. We will apply interfacing to the wrong side of that pocket. I'm going to flip this over. This is the front pant, and I'm going to apply interfacing here. Now it's pretty easy placement because we're going from the top up, and we have notches here for placement. So once you get these the interfacing fused here, you'll need to go back and clip those if you need to know if you can't see where your placement is. Okay, so I'm going to get these fused here, and it's always a good idea to use a press cloth. So I'll show you what that is. So I'm going to go grab my press cloth, and I'll be right back. Okay, so this is my press cloth. All that is another piece of 100% cotton fabric. So I'm just going to lay this over these, and I can do these kind of at the same time. So I'll lay this on top, and then I'm just going to hold. Now I know my iron is going to steam. It's, you know, you really shouldn't use steam on this, but I'm only having this on here for, just, a few seconds. So I want to make sure that that is on there really nice. The reason we want to do this, one, is we don't want that area to stretch while we're sewing. And of course, if you're putting your hands in your pockets a lot, it's a high stress area. So we want it to be stabilized really well. And let's just get this one right onto the pant. All right. Now, before I start sewing here, I'm just going to double check and see where my notches are. And I'm going to clip them. And of course, I forgot my scissors, so I'm just going to use my snips here. These ones are all right. So I'm just going to clip where that notch was. There it is. And then I'll do the same thing here. And those notches are important because that's how we're going to be placing. And also the notches are going to tell us where we're going to be sewing. So we're actually going to be sewing between these notches because I'm going to put these pockets in using a production method rather than a regular sewing method. Okay, so I've got all my notches clipped. Just show you again all the pieces we're going to be using. The pockets are mirrored. And then we have the front pant. Okay, and that's all we need. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the pocket that corresponds to the side, face sides together, and we'll match up the notches here. So I've got these two notches, and then I've got these two notches. So I'm going to line that up there with those notches, and then I will just go ahead and pin it. The other pocket we can just kind of set aside for right now. Later on, we're actually going to be attaching this to the other pocket. Now what we want to do, and I'm going to grab my erasable pen really quick to show you exactly where we're going to be sewing. Okay, so I've got my erasable pen here, and I've got this pinned together, again, pocket face side of the pocket to the face side of the pant. And then here is that notch, that notch down here. So I'm going to make a big mark here, right? Just so you can see where those are. And I'm going to push this pin up kind of at a diagonal for right now, out of the way so you can see it. So this is where we're going to be stitching. Let me put that up to the camera. So I've got my two marks, if I can get it here. We're going to stitch right between here using a 1/2 inch seam allowance. I think that's about 1/2 inch. 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're only going to stitch between these two notches. Okay, that's what we'll do right now. Okay, so we have that stitched, and let me just kind of fold it over so you can see it's stitched. So now what we want to do, you see where those notches are? We've stitched just between those notches. Now we want to clip into that seam allowance perpendicular just to the stitching. So I'm going to clip this. Do not go through that stitching, but just up to the top of it. Okay. All right, so now we have everything clipped, and what we're going to do is I'm going to turn this over, and what that does, that's going to tell me where I'm going to end up top. So I'm going to actually pull these seam allowances out, right? So I want to show you what it looks like. So if we fold that to the inside, these now fold out to that seam allowance, to the 1/2 inch seam allowance that we're going to need to sew on, and then our hand will be able to go in this way. So again, we've stitched between the marks, we've clipped into that, but now before we actually work with the other pocket, I'm going to pull this over, and I'm going to kind of press this lightly just between those notches, and I'm going to do some understitching. This is what's kind of confusing, is that, let me get this, this is the seam allowance. So understitching is a type of stitching that looks like top stitching, but understitching actually is keeping the seam allowance under another piece of fabric, usually a facing. In this case, it's a pocket. So right now I've got this folded over, and you can kind of pull here and see where the stitching is. That's actually where we clip to. We're going to understitch, which actually looks like top stitching, and I'm going to stitch that down, not past this stitching, okay? So again, I'll just mark on here where I'm going to stitch from and to. Okay. That's all I'm going to do, is I'm just going to understitch from there to there. Okay, so now I have the understitching done. I'm just going to press those marks away. And now with having that done, now you understand why I clipped under here first before doing that understitching, because it makes it easier to do that stitching. Now what I'm going to do, okay, and you can see this kind of flipping out this way. I may want to, no, that's fine, that's good. So you see how it's kind of flipping out toward the face side of the pant. Again, this is the pant leg, right? That's fine. So the pocket is flipping out. Now I want to pull that pant part out. Pull the pant part out, right? And they line up. Now I can actually just fold under that pocket. And now I'm just going to lightly press, get that to press under. Okay. And now the pocket is underneath on the wrong side. So now the pocket, the wrong side of the pocket is facing the wrong side of the pant. And this is the outside of the pant. Okay. And we want these clipped out. So this is our seam allowance. And eventually we're going to sew the the back of the out seam to this. But first, we're actually going to connect the other pocket. So remember, we have this other pocket. Now I can lay this right on top of here, and it matches up perfectly. And my notch here matches the notch to what we just clipped. But I'm going to just kind of pin it together, kind of on the pant, just in a couple of spots. Okay, but now for the pocket, what I'm going to do, I'll just kind of fold it away from the pant a little bit. Let me see if I can get this going the right way for you. Now I'm going to stitch a 1/2 inch seam all the way around and up here. Well, maybe I shouldn't do that. Okay, so the whole pocket is away. So a 1/2 inch all the way around and up here to this edge. So that's what I'm going to do, and that will create the pocket. Now there's going to be one step that I don't come back here for, so I'm going to actually overlock the edge after I stitch this. So a 1/2 inch seam all the way around the pocket, up all the way to the seam here. And then I'm going to, you'll see me do the overlocking all the way around, and then we will actually have the pocket completely ready to go for the next step. Okay, so now the pocket is pretty much done. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of press this flat a little bit. The overlock stretched out the outside of that pocket a little bit. So I just want to kind of press that down just a little bit. I'm going to flip it over to the face side here. And then let me just kind of repin this here just slightly. I'm going to do one step that you don't have to do. But I'm just going to do one step, the next step, just to hold everything in place. Just kind of press this pocket nice and flat. Pressing as you go makes your sewing go so much nicer. So now one of the things that I'm going to do that you don't have to do is I'm actually going to stitch. You see how this is loose, the pocket is loose. I'm actually going to stitch because this is on, we won't really be able to see. I'm just going to do a little kind of basting stitch just to hold the pocket together. So right here, right at from this corner, and that's kind of the seam allowance, just holding all of this pocket piece in place, because the next step is actually going to be attaching the back pant here on the side seam. Okay, so I'm just going to do that really quick, and that holds everything together just so I don't have these pins here. I'm going to do that real quick. Okay, so we've done that, and what that does is it holds the pocket all together, and to the side seam, okay? So that's all really nicely done, and we'll just take a little peek in here and see that we've got our understitching here, which makes nice presentation, and the opening for the pocket. So now the reason I call this a production method is because one operator can actually do the entire pocket and do work on all of the pockets and then pass it to the next operator to do the next step. So the next step is actually to join the back to the front here at the outseam. So I've got my back piece here, and make sure it's the right one. Of course, they won't match up if it's not. So I'm going to match the face side to the face side up here, and I'm going to match these notches to where the notches were on the front, and that's where I clipped. Okay, so that's where those go. And I'm just going to pin this really quickly, get this pinned, and then I'll show you the things that you need to worry about when you sew this. So I just want to pin this all the way up to the bottom here. And I'm going to pin in the direction of sewing for me, because I'm going to sew on this side. This fabric likes to stick to itself, even though it's lightweight. Okay, and I can readjust this as I go in the sewing machine too. Okay, so I've got this all pinned together. So now, one of the things that we have to look for is up here at the top. Let me just unpin this real quick. When we sew this, you use my pen as a pointer, we want to make sure that we're catching right here where we sewed it down, right? That's the corner. So we don't really want to go beyond that, because we don't actually want to be sewing on the actually pocket opening, which is right here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feel with my thumb, where is that part, feel that where that indentation is, and that's where I'm going to put my pin. Okay, because I know I need to get the needle there. And then as I sew, I can kind of come underneath and just kind of pull the pocket a little bit. See if I can fold this over so you can see. Pull the top part of the pocket away under here so that you don't sew the pocket to the outseam. So again, on this side, I'm going to feel where that little indentation is. I'll put the pin where it is that I need to sew. And then I'll show you, if you don't quite get there, what you can do when you come back. After we actually sew the outseam, what you can do if you just need to get just a little bit closer. But I'm going to have a go at this. Again, it's a 1/2 inch seam allowance right here, and maybe I'll mark it. This is where that corner is. And let's see, right here is also where that corner is. So I need to make sure that I'm getting as close to that corner as possible. So I'll now sew the entire outseam with a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, so now our pant is sewn on the outside and the pocket, and now what we need to do is let's flip this over on itself and see how we did. So here's our pocket, and then the entrance to the pocket is here. And if you look up close here on this side, I was right there. I don't see any other of that stitching. But down here on the bottom, I was a little bit shy. I mean, it's not bad, and it's probably really not that noticeable, but it looks like I have maybe just a thread width. I could actually go back and correct that. You can kind of see that stitching line. So what I can do is, if I flip this back over, and I flip it over to the pocket side, you can see where the stitching is on the outside here. So this one closest to my pen tip is actually the stitch line, and I can actually come here and do one stitch just on the outside following that all the way through until I can come back to my other stitching here. And it's just slight, and I'll probably come up from the bottom, so I'll probably start right about here. It's hard to do this with only 2 hands. So I'll probably start right about here and then gradually come up, and it's really just 1 thread width once I begin here and coming up to where I've marked, right? And then I can actually just go back into my stitching pretty quickly, just because I'm trying to just get that one little bit, just that slight additional coverage of that pocket at the bottom there. Okay, so we'll see what that looks like. Okay, so I've done that extra little stitching. Let's see how it turned out. Actually, I need to fold it that way. And actually, it looks a lot better. So we don't see that stitching at all. And it's just that little bit of stitching. It's not going to affect the fit at all. What it does is it just kind of covers our little stitching there and our clips, right? And we still have our nice opening here. Now, the last step of this is we're going to overlock the outseam. And we'll be right back here. Okay, so we've got the outseam stitched and overlocked. I'm going to just take 1 quick press of this. And actually that will also eliminate all of those markings. Right? And if you want to, we can also press that seam toward the back, because the reason it goes toward the back is because it helps the pocket to lay nice and flat. So I'm just going to do this, and this is also what you would call your inseam pocket. And again, that was pretty much the production method of doing that. With this last bit pressed. And then our next step is to sew the inseam. And of course, this is one of the pant legs. So I will fold this back over to match the inseams up here. And then follow the curve. So you may need a slight stretch, just because the back is a little bit more curved than the front. And actually, I'm going to sew from the top here. Let's switch it around. I'm going to sew from the top down. And you can, of course, manage this as you sew as well. Just get these. Okay, so I'm going to do a couple of steps all in one before we come back and do the next step. So this is the inseam. We're going to sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way down. We're going to overlock this. I'm going to overlock mine together, and then I'm going to press it toward the front. Okay. Now you can stitch this down, overlock the seam separately, and press it open, but sometimes that is kind of irritating on the leg. So I like to press it toward the front. That way when you walk, nothing actually kind of gets stuck on your leg. Okay, so if you check your pants, most of your inseams are actually pressed toward the front. So again, stitch it, overlock it, press it toward the front. Now, I've just done one pant leg. I'm going to do the other pant leg off camera. Once we have the 2 pant legs done, we're actually going to connect them via the rise, the crotch, and the back and front crotch rise, and then we'll be ready to connect it to the bodice. Okay, so the inseam is sewn. I'm just going to press it to set those stitches in really quick. And then I have my press ham, and I'm going to actually just turn this, be a little bit easier for me. Get this inside the leg, and this fabric likes to stick to this thing because its top is wool felt, so it's hard to get it all in here. I'm actually going to go from the bottom up because I'm going to have to scrunch it to get the top part. So let's get this all the way down. And again, I'm going to press this toward the front. And of course, your pant legs will be larger than this, so you can probably just press them right onto your ironing board. That will be easy. But this is half size, so it's kind of snug here. Okay, so I'm going to press this seam toward the front. The reason I started at the bottom is because it would be all bunched up here at the top, so I don't want to have that. Now I've got to pull this down without stretching the fabric too much. I don't want it to get stretched out of shape. Make sure everything is nice and smooth and flat, and then press here. So that means when we sew the crotch seam or the rise seams, all of these seams will be going toward the front. Okay, and there we have it. So one of the pant legs is all done. I'm going to go ahead and do the other, and let me just show you what that rise will look like. So this is the front here. I have a single notch, and then the back here is the double notches. So what we're going to do when we come back in just a second is I'm going to have the other pant leg. This one is wrong side out. The other will be face side out, and I will put that one inside this one and match up the seam and the notches, and then I will sew all the way around the crotch, and that will join the two pant legs. All right, so now that we have both pant legs completed and ready to join together at the rise seams, I have one that is the wrong side out, and I have the other with the face side out. And I have both, this is the front, I have the single notch here, and then this is the front on the other. So what I'm actually going to do now is I'm going to take the face side out pant, and I'm going to insert it inside of the other pant leg, which is the wrong side out. And I'm just going to have to get in here to pull this in gently. And I want to be matching up here first at these inseam seams, right? Because we want to make sure that that actually is matching pretty closely. So here it is. So, and I've got those seams again pressed toward the front, and I'm going to line up those seam lines all the way up to the cut edge, and I'm just going to put a pin in there real quick, because then from that point, then I can match the other edges, the front rise at the front rise notches here. Put a pin there, and then on up to the waist edge. And then you'll probably just have to kind of work with the fabric to get everything to lay nice and flat in here. And I'm just going to pin this like that. And then I'll go ahead and match up my back double notches here on the rise. And then of course you can adjust as you sew. And then back up to the center back at the waist. Get that pinned. And I'm just gonna kind of let the fabric kind of even out there, right? So that's how we have it right now. So both of those are matched together. And of course, you'll just come back in here, and I like to just double check again for my seams matching here at the crotch. And I'm just going to put that pin back in here. Now I'm going to put this in, and I'm going to sew from the back all the way around to the front. And that actually helps me because then I don't have to worry about getting my front inseams all going the wrong way. So if I sew from the back all the way around to the front, it's actually pushing those seams in the right direction, which is toward the front. So I'm going to do 2 steps before I come back to the pressing mat. I'm going to actually sew the seam, a 1/2 inch seam allowance all the way around, and then I will overlock the seam closed. Okay, so now the 2 pant legs are sewn together along the rise, and I'm just going to give it a quick press along that seam just to set those stitches to make sure everything lays nice and flat. All right, and then I'm going to pull this one leg out, and we'll have a look at the inside. Get this leg all pulled out to the wrong side. And then we'll turn it out to the face side to have a look at that. Okay. So now this is the pant. This is the front of the pant. The pockets are folding to the front, and we can actually take a pin for the time being and just kind of pin those pockets up here. We could actually baste them down if we want, but I'm going to kind of take care of all of this when I do the actual seam to the bodice. Okay, so this is the front again, okay, of the pant, and then this is the back of the pant. All right, so I'm actually going to turn this face side out now. Get in here, because we're going to need the pant face side out in order to sew the waist seam. At least that's the way I'm going to do it. Okay. This is the back, and now this is the front, right? I have single notches here for the front, and then I have just double notches back here on the back. Okay, so I'm going to lay this here for right now. I'm going to keep the front side up, and I've just pinned the top of the pockets here to the front because all of that's going to need to get pinned together for the next step. And the next step is actually joining the bodice and the pant together. So I'm going to grab that, and I'll be right back. Okay, so I brought the bodice in to actually join it to the pant. Now, if you're unsure which is the front of the bodice and which is the back, remember that the back is more narrow than the front of the bodice, and the front bodice has this slight curve, and that's to add for the blousing effect. So the thing that we are going to need to do on the bodice first, I have it here face side out, and I'm actually going to find the center of the back and the center of the front at the waist. So I'm just going to fold it to the seam, and then I'm going to put a pin here at the fold. And I didn't put a notch there on the pattern because it's cut on the fold, and sometimes when you do that, you only get half a notch, and you're not quite sure what to do with it. So that's why I just kind of look for to finding the center front and the center back this way. Okay, so our prepared bodice is kind of all ready to go, and the one thing that we need to do to get these together is I need to turn the bodice to the wrong side. So turn this to the wrong side. Okay, now I have, these are the 2 waists that it's going to go to, and the easiest way that I kind of like to do this is I'm going to turn the bodice so the top of the bodice is toward the waist, and then I'm just going to put that pant inside the bodice here and kind of pull that out so I can see it here. And now I have the pant here, the front pant at the waist, and I'm going to match that seam to the waist pin on the bodice at the center front. Okay, and then I'm going to walk the pant over to the side seam of the bodice. And again, this fabric is very thin and it likes to stick to itself. So I'm just going to match that seam up. Now remember that this seam, because we're actually creating a casing for the elastic, I have a 1-inch seam allowance, just like I did for the top of the bodice. Here I'm coming around to the center back seam of the pant, and I'm going to match that seam to the pin. And then I'll come around to the other side seam and match that up as well. Now there are a couple other notches along the way that you can match up. And of course, this is a half size pattern, so I don't have as far to go. And as far as sewing, yours is going to be bigger. Okay, so now the thing is that in the front we have this kind of blousing effect. It's kind of curved. We want to make sure that our edges line up, and I'm matching my notches here in the front. Match those notches, and this is going to actually ease in as we sew. Okay. Matching up the other side. I'm just going to match. I like to match like the center front and the center back and the side seams, and then I will actually go back and match the notches. But understand at the front, because it has that blousing curved edge, which is slightly longer, you're going to have to ease that into your seam when you sew. All right, and it helps if you actually have that on the bottom. So I'm going to ease this in a little bit here. If you put that on the bottom where your feed dog's in is, then the larger piece it helps it to ease that fabric into the smaller area, which is usually your top stitching. There's not a whole lot here to ease, so that will just help out. So we've got a lot of pins going on here. So what I started to say before is that I have a 1-inch seam allowance here for our casing. So make sure that when you pin, like to match your seams, that you go down about 1 inch and you check those seams matching up, and you put your pin approximately where that inch seam is going to be sewn using your machine. So I'm actually just going to double check my pins and make sure that they're actually within that 1 inch area, because I don't want to have the fabric being overstretched, or sometimes if it looks like it's being stretched in one direction. It's called roping. And I don't kind of want that effect. And of course, I'm just double checking to make sure I have my pockets going toward the front, because sometimes they will flip out this way, and we don't want that. It won't look very pretty. Here's the other side seam that I'm just going to check here, kind of matching the seams all the way up to the edge, and then I'm going to pin at that 1 inch area. It's just putting your pins a little bit lower. That's all it really is. Check this back seam. Okay. Now I think we're ready to sew. Okay, so I'm going to go over to the machine. I'm going to stitch the bodice to the pant using a 1-inch seam allowance. Okay, so before I begin, really quickly, I have to do a 1-inch seam allowance for this waist seam here. But I need to know where that 1-inch guide is here. Remember, my blue tape here identifies my 1/2-inch seam. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my see-through ruler, and I'm going to line up my 1/2-inch line here on my ruler with that edge. And of course, another 1/2 inch is 1 inch. And I have some style tape here. I'm just going to actually lay this additional tape here. Let's see, my hand is in the way. So let me kind of come from the back this way. So I'm going to hold the ruler here and that 1/2 inch and see if I can do this from the back, and laying this tape there. There we go. That's pretty straight, and then I'm going to need to straighten that out, so excuse my hand here. while I straighten that out. Let me just double check that. Let's go over just a little bit more. Okay, there we go. So that's my 1-inch edge. Okay, and I can take that off when I'm done. And again, sorry for my hand being in the way. It's hard to do that, getting everything in the camera. So right here will be my 1-inch edge, and I'm going to go ahead and sew that seam now. Okay, so the bodice is now sewn to the pant, and we're going to do, eventually we're going to actually fold this entire seam up toward the bodice and stitch it down to create the casing. Now there's one thing we're going to do to eliminate some of the bulk. We don't need both of these seams, but because we're folding the seam up toward the bodice, we only need actually the pant seam allowance for the width of the casing. So we're going to be trimming the seam allowance of the bodice down to about 1/4 inch. So now I want you to take extra caution when you do this, that you don't accidentally cut both the seam allowances or altogether cut the wrong one. I actually did that in one of the samples I made in preparing this pattern and garment for sale. So just take precautions. And I brought my tabletop ironing board in here because I'm just going to put it here at the top, and that's just to separate some of the fabric. So now this is the bodice fabric, and now I can kind of fold this here, grab my scissors, and then come in here and just start trimming. And now I know it just kind of makes it a little bit easier. You have less to deal with. So again, about 1/4 inch, and make sure that you don't grab the other seam allowance there, because we're going to be folding that up. And just do little by little. I'm going to stop there, and then I'm going to kind of turn this around. And I actually may use this ironing board to actually fold up and pin. Once I get this all trimmed, I'm actually going to take this over to the overlock machine, and I'm going to overlock this other seam allowance here, the pant seam allowance, without cutting anything off. You want to try to keep most of the height of that seam allowance. Remember, we're using 3/4 inch wide elastic, and this is a 1-inch seam allowance that we just sewed. And so we need a little bit of room to get that in there. So we're going to be stitching it down with 1/8 inch, but not more than 1/4 inch to the bodice. Okay, so I can get the rest of this cut quickly. You just see how I'm taking my time and checking underneath, making sure I didn't cut, because I made that mistake before. All right, so now that I've got that bodice trim, that bodice seam allowance trimmed, I'm going to go over and overlock just the edge of the pant seam allowance right here. Okay, so now that our seam for our waist casing is all done, we've got it overlocked here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pull these pant legs through so everything is to the wrong side. Put that in there. Okay. these legs pulled out. Okay, doesn't really matter a whole lot because we're only going to be working with the waist. Okay, so this is now our waist seam. And I'm going to get it here at the side seam. We need to actually fold this up to the bodice. Now underneath here, you're going to need to make sure that it doesn't get bunched up, okay? So I'm actually just going to, can't really put this in here because now yours will be larger. You could probably get yours in the top of your ironing board if you want, but I can't get mine in here because it's I have a half size. So I'm going to kind of just do this by hand. So I'm folding this up kind of along the seam, and then I'm just going to pin it in the way that I'm going to be sewing. So I need to sew here, and I keep switching this around because it's easier for me to hold on to it. Now just kind of press, so obviously you want to make sure that you're pinning the seam allowance up so it's going straight flat instead of kind of getting it pinned over going this way. That's not good. So I would just lay everything flat as you can get it, and make sure that that seam allowance lays flat. And just put your hand underneath and just kind of feel for that seam that everything is getting flat. And then grab your pin, and of course I'm doing this backwards for myself, and just go ahead and pin that in. Okay, let's see if I can do this with my, just holding it. So I'm feeling underneath, pressing that up. I'm just going to hold this here with this thumb, grab a pin, and just kind of pin it. And I'm going to go back here and just kind of pin that. Now you'll have to remove these pins. Again, this area of the, especially in the front, this is the back, but you'll have to feel under here for the front of the bodice, or at least the bodice part as you're sewing. Make sure that it doesn't create any gathers or puckering as you're sewing. So you'll have to continue checking that. And you'll see me doing that in the machine when I get there. So I'm just going to go ahead and pin the rest of this up, and then I will actually flip it to the face side so you can see where the pins are. And again, we are going to be using 3/4 inch wide elastic. So when we sew this down, let me get this pinned in here. When we sew this down, we need that area between our actual waist stitch line and where we're stitching this down. So we need to make sure that that's at least 3/4 inch wide. Otherwise, we take the chance of the elastic kind of buckling on the inside, and we don't want that to happen because that leads to twisting. So get the rest of this pinned up, and I'm hopefully going to be stitching right here in the middle of my overlocking thread. That should give me enough space for the elastic to move through smoothly. Okay, so I've got everything pinned. I'm just going to turn this face side out so you can see where I've pinned, and we can just kind of judge to see if we've got any overages on that seam. We don't want that. Okay, so here is the side seam, okay, and I've got the pin here. And what I'm talking about overages is we don't want, you can see the seam here is nicely folded up. We don't want that seam to be folded over that while we stitch. Otherwise, we're going to get this gaping here on the underside. We want to make sure that that seam is nicely pressed up toward that as we sew. And so you'll have to continually check that underneath. Now this side, the face side, is going to be toward the feed dogs, which will actually help kind of do a little bit of gathering and just kind of easing in as you sew. So that will actually help. I'm going to have to go in this way, and I'm actually going to put it in the machine this way. So you have a larger opening, and so I'm doing a half size, so your opening here will be a little bit larger. But I'm going to get in here, you'll see me put it in the machine, and then I'm going to start sewing, and it'll be going in a circular motion, but I'm going to continually check underneath the machine, making sure I'm not going to get any puckers or gathers, okay? So now I will mention to you right now, I know I started with the bodice to get that all ready and finished because I wanted to show the sections and the process of sewing it together. At this point, if you wanted to wait on doing the actual top of the bodice elastic until last, of course you can do that, and then you would have a much larger opening to work with this. But I wanted to show you working from the bodice to the pant how this actually goes together. Okay, so we can't go sew yet because I forgot one important thing, and I think you should have gotten a reminder about that while I was actually pinning. So I just want to remind you that, let me pull this out again, I'm going to have to fold it. We need to leave an opening for the elastic. This is the front, so I'm going to turn it around to the back, and I'm just going to put some pins in here toward the back. I don't like doing it right at the center back because there's a lot of bulk there. So I like to do it kind of like here on one of the side areas of the back. And I'm just going to put some perpendicular pins in there and, leave about a 3-inch opening. I'm leaving slightly smaller because this is half size. So I'm going to leave an opening here. So I'll stitch from here, I'll stitch all the way around and stop here. No need to backstitch because we're going to go over that stitching. And of course backstitching kind of creates some bulk and sometimes it doesn't look that nice. So I'm going to leave this part open and that's where we're going to actually be able to insert our elastic. So that's all. Now we're going to go sew it in the machine. All right, so our seam is all stitched up here to the bodice, and I've left this opening here. And we are actually going to insert the elastic in there the exact same way we did it for the bodice. So I'm actually going to speed this section up, but before I do that, I'm just going to remind you that you'll need to mark off your stitch lines for your elastic. So again, I've got my ruler and I'm going to use about a 1/2 inch. And those will be overlapped, right? And so once we get them, both of the elastics come out the same end, I'm going to overlap them like this on top of each other, and then I'll stitch right down there this mark, and that will create the ring. Now, one of the things as a reminder, as you go through this, you want to make sure that your elastic is not twisting. And then, of course, when you come back to the beginning, that you don't accidentally twist it around on itself. So just double check all that stuff as you go. Again, I'm going to start by piercing one end of the elastic with my big safety pin, and I kind of thread it through. For me, it just pulls through a little bit easier. And then on the other end, remember, I like to put the pin perpendicular to the width, to the length of the elastic, and that keeps it from going back inside if I pull too hard. Now again, I just want to remind you, when you come to your seams, you may have to do additional wiggling to get around those seams, okay? So I'm going to speed this up because you saw how to do the casing for the elastic on the top of the bodice, so I don't think you need to actually see me do it in real time this time. It's just that you have more fabric to work with. Okay, so the elastic is all closed up right here, and all we need to do is, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to distribute some of this fabric just by kind of pulling it. See how it's all bunched up right here? Let's kind of, distribute that around and kind of even out that fabric. And of course, around the pockets is going to be a little bit difficult just because there's so much thickness there. Just kind of ease it around, stretch it, and move some of that fabric around. And this may take you just a little bit of work, but once you get it more even around, you'll have a nicer looking waist area with the elastic. And these areas where the pockets are being kind of stubborn. Of course, I'm working with a smaller pattern, an area of fabric, so you'll probably have a little bit easier time with that. Okay, well that's enough of that for right now. Okay, so we are almost done. We have a couple of more steps. So we actually, the bodice and everything up here is all done. We actually just need to do the hem on the pant. And I'm going to do an extra step which you don't have to do. Of course, the hem allowance is 3/4 of an inch, and of course you can overlock the edge, turn it up the 3/4 inch, and just stitch it down. Turn it up to the inside. But what I'm going to do, because I have such small openings here, I'm actually going to mark what that 3/4 inch is, and then I'm going to press up. Now, I am not going to overlock, press up, and stitch down. That's a pretty easy hem. I don't think you really need to see that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do a rolled hem. And because these pants are kind of tapered, and so sometimes you will need to actually work that into the taper if you're turning it up. But on this one, the taper is kind of subtle, so you can actually just stretch it a little bit, and that will be fine. You should have little triangles here. They kind of fit right into the top. So when you turn it up, this opening actually fits into the top. Now, if you've shortened the pattern, you want to make sure that you add a little bit extra when you shorten the pattern so that you actually angle the hem out just a little bit. So, so it can fit in when you turn it up, okay? But now, since I'm actually going to roll the hem, I'm going to show you how to do that, if that's how you would rather do it. So I did a pretty good job here of cutting and matching up my seams. So I'm just going to do this line and match it up, find my 3/4 mark on my ruler, and I'm just going to take my erasable pen and just kind of jot a line. That's one side. Here's the back. Do the same thing here. And of course, you only need to see me do this once. So now what I'm going to do, I've got that marked. Now what I'm going to do, let's do this. Be careful with the iron. I'm going to set this on a low setting because I just need to actually turn this up. Now, remember that, let's go back to the inseam and let's find our back. So something is going on here. Okay, so which side is the back? We need to know that, okay, so this is the back. So that means that my seam allowance is pressed here toward the front. So we want to make sure that we get all the seams going the same way. Otherwise, they will twist on us, and we don't want that to happen. So toward the front, here's the one I marked. This is going toward the front, so I'm folding that seam allowance toward the front. And then I'm going to fold it on that line that I marked. And then I'm just going to press it up at that point. Now, because I'm actually doing this, I'm doing a rolled hem, it's actually the finished roll hem will actually be 3/8 of an inch wide, because half of 3/4 of an inch is 3/8. I'm going to just double check my outseam. Here's the outseam, my pocket, and so that seam should be going toward the back, right? And it is. So I'm just going to fold that on that line, and then I'll get a good mark from my iron. And then one last press. Okay. So now I have a really nice press mark, so I'm going to fold this out so you can actually see that mark, that press line right here. And so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to fold the cut edge in to match up to that press line, and then I'll just fold up again. And I don't usually pin this, but I'm going to pin this for you so you can see it. So right there, and then I'm just going to follow that method, fold in the cut edge to that press line, fold up again, and of course you can pin it. Of course, this is a lightweight fabric, so if you have a heavier weight fabric, I would probably just overlock and press it up, because you need the weight of the fabric to actually pull the fabric down by gravity. But since this is a really lightweight fabric, I'm doing a rolled hem, and the size of the hem is actually appropriate for the weight of the fabric. Now, if you want a heavier hem, you want to do a rolled hem, you may want to add a 1/4 inch or more to the length, and then roll that in if you prefer doing a rolled hem. Okay, so now I have that all pinned up, right? And we're going to stitch right here on that folded edge, and I'm actually going to start on this inseam, right? So actually I'll just use my pen and to mark it. This is kind of where I'm going to start. So I'm going to start right about here, go all the way around. It'll be less noticeable on the, sorry, I didn't have that in the camera frame. So I'm going to start here on the inseam. I've marked it where I'm going to start. And this will just be less noticeable because I'm starting on the inseam. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we will talk about the next step. Okay, so the hems are done. I'm just going to really quickly just give those hems from the inside a quick press to set all those stitches and make sure all my markings are gone. And then technically our jumpsuit is done. There is one more optional accessory which I'm going to actually do, and that's the sash. So let's have a look at this really quick. Okay, and yes, the legs look really long, but actually this is a shorter bodice. And then of course the pant legs. So here is our elastic waist, and then our pockets, our inseam pockets are right here. And then of course the elastic around the upper bust, and then straps. Of course the straps are optional. So let's move on to actually the sash to complete the ensemble. Okay, so these are the sash pieces for the jumpsuit, and there are 2, and I'm going to match them face to face. And of course we have notches. They're both the same size. So I'm actually going to use a double notches, and I'm going to sew this together on this side. Of course it doesn't matter which of these sides that you choose to sew it. Just make sure that you're sewing the short end. And we're going to sew these 2 together using a 1/2 inch seam allowance, and we're not going to overlock. We're actually just going to come back here, and we're going to press that seam open to get ready for the next step. Okay, so the seam is sewn. I'm quickly just going to do a press to set those stitches. Then I'm going to lay this out flat with the wrong side up. See if I can separate these pieces. So wrong side up. And I'm actually just going to open up this seam. Make sure everything is nice and flat. And then I'm going to press that open. Then what I'm going to do, lengthwise, I'm going to fold it in half lengthwise. Make sure my seams are matching, and I'm going to pin that together. And then go ahead and pin all the way down. You don't have to pin if you don't want to. but I'm going to do that just to make sure all the edges stay together. Okay, and do that on the opposite side. And then we're going to actually sew this all down together. And instead of leaving these short ends open, we're actually going to sew those together as well. The reason is because it's easier to do it the way that I'm going to do it. Otherwise, if you leave these open and then pull it out in a tube, what happens is that you have to have two top stitching lines, or you have to hand stitch them closed. So what I'm going to do is the same thing I did with the waist, is I'm just going to put two perpendicular pins, maybe just, about 3 inches apart. And then what we're going to do is I'm going to start here, back stitch. I'm going to stop here at my 1/2 inch mark. So I forgot, I didn't bring my ruler. I didn't think I was going to actually do this. But let me grab my ruler and I'll mark these corners so you can see what I'm talking about. So this is my 1/2 inch seam here. And then I've got a 1/2 inch seam going here. And here at this corner point, I'm going to put the needle down and I'm going to pivot that corner. And then what I'm going to do is I'm actually just going to clip these, come back and clip the corners, and then I'm going to turn everything face side out through this opening. Okay, so I may as well just go ahead and mark this corner as well, because I'm just going to do this quickly in the sewing machine. And of course, this is just a sash, so this is optional. So if you have something in your closet, of course, you can use that, or a belt, or do it out of another fabric like you saw at the intro to this tutorial. I had a different colored sash than the actual garment, right? So I'm going to do this over in the machine really quick. Okay, so that is all sewn. Now what I like to do is I'm just going to press the stitch line, but not this folded edge here. Otherwise, you'll have a crease on the outside, and we don't want that just yet. So I'm just going to press my stitch line, and that'll set the stitches. And then I'm actually going to clip my corners. So I'm going to clip the corner close to the corner, but not all the way there. All right? Okay, that's all I'm going to do. This is a lightweight fabric. If you have a heavier fabric, you can cut diagonal this way too, and that will ease up some of the bulk that's right around the corners. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to find my opening, and I'm actually just going to start turning inside out. This short end is actually easier, right? And then on this end, I will just start to turn everything else inside out just by pushing that fabric up there and pulling it out. And you can't see what I'm doing really, right? Pushing all of this in here and then kind of getting in here and pulling from this little hole that it creates when you get that on the outside. Just kind of pull with your fingers, and it may take you a few minutes. It would be the same as if even if you kept the corners open, you'd still have a hard time. So get in there. If you grab onto where that seam allowance is, you should be able to pull that right out. Okay, so you saw I had a little bit of trouble and I used my pen to just kind of poke everything through. Now if you want sharper corners, I have a point turner here, and I can insert this here and kind of push this all the way up until we get to that corner. I'm going to pull this here, and we might be able to just kind of tap on that seam a little bit, turn it over, get that other little point out there. And then let's do that up to the short end. Of course, if you have a better way of making your sashes, by all means. Okay, so there we go. We've got good points here. Now I'm going to take one press, and remember we have this opening, and I want this seam. I'm going to actually press that first, get that, pull those seams out so they're matched up, and I'm actually just going to top stitch that closed. So I'm going to actually just kind of press that area first, and then kind of wiggle that seam out, make sure that's a good seam, nice and flat, kind of finger press that as I go along. Of course, if you're using a synthetic, you may not be able to finger press it to get it down, and if you are using a synthetic, you'll definitely want to use a press cloth, otherwise you might melt that to your iron, and you don't want that to happen. Okay, so now I'm just going to go ahead and press this whole thing. Just have it pressed, and then I will go ahead and close that up, and then our sash will be done. Basically just kind of a tie. Okay, I'm going to go stitch that together. Okay, and there is our completed sash all stitched up there. You can barely see that. So let's bring in the jumpsuit. Okay. And then, of course, you can tie the sash around the waist. And I know I'm not going to make a very good bow, so I'm just going to actually tie this here in just like a double knot to make sure that the sash goes down the wrong way. I mean, down toward the pant, not the wrong way. And then there is our top, of course, and then our pant legs are there. So there it is. That's the complete process of constructing the jumpsuit.